Hello and welcome to New Hampshire Peace Action's Peace and Justice Conversation series. We have these every other Monday night from 7 to 8, and we are now streaming on our Facebook page and YouTube. We are extremely excited tonight to have Paul, who I've worked with for the last 11 years at New Hampshire Peace Action. He's been political director. I'm not going to read off bios. They were sent out in the email, so you know who you're talking to. And Lilly, who is newer to Peace Action, but is running our campaigns. Given where we are with the elections, it's still a little bit unclear what our future holds, but I wanted as soon as possible after the elections to have some folks from National come in and tell us what they think the next at least couple of years are likely to look like for us as far as strategic planning. So I'm not going to take up too much time with introductions, just to say that I'm really, really pleased that both of you were able to be with us tonight, and I'm grateful to be able to disseminate this knowledge to our members so that we can move forward unified. Did one of you want to go first? Do you have a preference?
I can start and kick off a little bit with a recap of our work. But first off, I just want to say thank you to Will and all you folks in New Hampshire for the work that you do on the behalf of peace and moving this agenda forward as well. So thank you all. And, you know, in terms of next steps, I'll let Paul get to that and looking ahead. But just in looking back a little bit on this election cycle and the one that we have now seemingly come to a fairly, comfortable end with, we put together one of the most ambitious peace voter campaigns this year in decades. We endorsed the most candidates and really had a sophisticated and broad program that kicked off early this year with the primaries and getting folks like Marie Newman and Jamal Bowman and other progressives that are now going to expand the squad into Congress. And so that's been really great to be able to have those victories to look back on. And we ended up endorsing something like 84 candidates this year, including a good handful of incumbents, and protected some key incumbents like Peter DeFazio in Oregon, whose race was fairly tight, and folks like Andy Kim, who are going to keep the caucus and keep the House for us. Obviously, folks have seen the Senate results and know that, the wins that the polls projected weren't quite there, but all eyes are on Georgia. And so in terms of next steps, that is a place where we plan to be involved. We did support Reverend Warnock in his race, had an organizer there who was able to help with the vote integrity, who stayed on a few days after the election to help with vote curing, which is part of the reason we're seeing that margin narrow right now. And we were able to play that sort of role in a lot of key places. So even though not all of our endorsed candidates won their races, folks like Cara Eastman in Nebraska's second, we were able to really invest heavily in, and we were phone banking into that race for about a month or so prior to the vote, and had an organizer virtually assisting there as well. And so that's a race that on election night was an electoral college seat that was called early, that really did sort of show Trump's chances narrowing. So there was a lot of these sort of strategic decisions that we made when looking at our peace voter program about how we could oust Trump, biggest threat to our agenda on peace and all sorts of progressive issues, really. Ideally flip the Senate and help get more progressives into the House. And so we were still at least able to win on two of those fronts. And we've got our work ahead of us come January for these Georgia races as well. And so, are planning to continue supporting Reverend Warnock and ensuring that we get as close to a favorable Congress for our issues as we can, because we're going to have to push the Biden administration. And I'll take questions on more of the particulars, but I don't want to rehash too much of the past. And so I will hand it off to Paul to then get into what that new Congress will look like with this Biden administration.
Great. Thanks so much, Lily. And big thanks to Will, Amy, and Doreen for having us on. Do know that New Hampshire is kind of one of there's a few affiliates that have paid staff, which is great. It's long been one of our more effective affiliates, and especially with emphasis on the presidential primaries. You guys have just done some great work. I've been on a ton of lobby visits with Will, and in fact, was lucky to know Will before he even worked for Peace Action. And all the staff know Will by name. That just shows how effective you guys are and how good lobbyists lobby work that you do. And a big kudos to Lilly. It really was a big peace voter effort this year, and it would not have happened without Lily's coordination and hard work and long hours. It's a challenging work to do so many endorsements, and we hired a good dozen organizers to work in races around the country, and all that takes lots and lots of work. So thanks, Lily. So implications, I'm going to take a look at a few things. One, look at the Biden presidency a bit, talk a little bit maybe about personnel, budget, and policy, then take a little bit of a look at the Congress and what may or may not happen there, and maybe then a couple of words on the future, and then I'm more interested in hearing people's questions, and we can kind of go from there. So with Biden, I do definitely believe that personnel is policy, and that is going to be one of the major shifts that we'll see between Biden and the Trump presidency. There are several thousand positions that the Biden administration will be appointing. And some of those, a few thousand, 1,200 or so of those are confirmed by the Senate. That's why the Senate really is kind of a big deal on why we're putting probably effort into trying to make sure the Democrats take it. We are not a partisan. We have endorsed a few Republicans in the past, but just know, historically, Republicans score, in the low 5-10% or less, sometimes 0 on our voting records, and Democrats tend to score around 80% or higher. So it will make a big difference if the Democrats get the Senate on what the Biden administration will be able to accomplish or not accomplish. But that being said, the personnel is huge. And there's a lot of pressure on Biden to make sure that personnel is diverse. We know that the personnel that will come in, a lot of them will come in with some serious experience. We'll have probably holdovers from the from the Obama administration, maybe even from the Clinton administration. We'll have folks from NGOs, so some people with some real experience. I mean, we all know that we saw in the Trump administration, people who really didn't know what they were doing, or were specifically wanting to, destroy government in some ways. So that is going to be a huge shift. And then we'll have career civil servants. There are tens of thousands of career civil servants, and some who had to put their head down during the last 4 years. Many left. But some put their head down and kept quiet, and probably you'll find out a lot more stories about resistance from the inside. But now those career civil servants are going to be more open to be able to do some of the work. So that will be a fair shift. For Peace Action, we will probably have relationships with some very senior people who will end up going into the administration, just because we have over 20 years now of working here on the Hill and relationship building. We will probably know some senior people, and so hopefully that will provide us some access to be able to influence. Already, we have sent some coalition letters, some recommendations, our platform, to high-level folks in the Biden transition and the Biden campaign. And we expect that now with this White House, we'll be invited to come back to the White House for meetings. During the Obama administration, we went for regular meetings in the White House to talk about issues, and we were able to represent Peace Action's views with senior staff. We have not been able to do that in the Trump administration, surprisingly. We will be able to do that, I assume, moving forward. And those for example, in the Obama administration, we did make a difference. We were one of the groups who put a lot of pressure on the Obama administration to go and visit Hiroshima. And President Obama was the first president to visit Hiroshima as a sitting president. And we were in small meetings where we were advising the White House on what we thought that should be done on that trip. And we expect that type of action and access, hopefully during the Biden administration, so that we'll be able to push our agenda. So personnel is a huge thing. And then after that is, I would say, budget. Even though typically the president's budget is usually kind of dead on arrival, it is kind of a general idea of what the Biden administration will want to see coming from Congress. And it helps inform what they may or may not veto, and what they're pushing for, and it gives, you know, at least Democrats an idea of how to pass budgets and work on the budget process, which is somewhat broken right now. To that end, we have been already setting up very high level, some high level briefings with people who worked on previous transition budgets and who have briefed some of our colleague organizations. And coming up, they're going to brief some congressional staff to talk about what the budget process is going to be. The Biden administration will need to put together a budget for 2022 within the first few months of the presidency. It's a very challenging thing to do, and they won't even have all the staff appointed or put in place. So how that typically works then is there's like a transition team that does it, and it's always been kind of an opportunity to perhaps either lower the growth or perhaps even shrink the Pentagon budget. And it's something that we are pushing for because you don't have all the internal staff who are fighting for more money for this, more money for that. There is kind of an opportunity here, which we are working on in the short term, to have the Biden budget be lower, especially on the Pentagon, and higher in other places, such as the Department of State, which has been decimated. You know that the Trump administration wanted to cut that by 30%. USAID, and other places in which we know an ounce of a prevention is worth a pound of cure. And there's a lot of prevention and diplomacy and development, and making sure that there's funds going there and funds going away from the Pentagon. So definitely see some opportunities. So budget is a huge thing that I think we'll see different with the Biden administration. Next will be policy. We expect some major policy differences on issues that we work a lot on. So first would be the Iran nuclear agreement, or the JCPOA. Biden has already said that they will try to reinitiate that. So that is something that we all worked on for several years, starting in 2006, to first make sure the Bush administration didn't go into Iran like Vice President Cheney wanted to, like Iraq, which we were able to push back on. And then when Obama came out, we took some of those coalitions to help him get this Iran agreement, which did certainly tamp down on Iran's nuclear activities, or their ability to, if they chose, to go to any kind of a nuclear weapon. So getting that back in place, we should see that. The START treaty, we will likely see that extended. Other treaties may either come back or be done. There was starts of building new nuclear weapons under the Trump administration, which we expect the Biden administration to stop or stall. Biden has supported the issue of no first use, so we're hoping to see some sort of a change in that around nuclear weapons. The new administration always has to do something called the nuclear posture review. So we hope to see a better nuclear posture review even than the one that we saw under the Obama administration, which that sets the policy, which would help enable us to lower spending on nuclear weapons and their delivery systems. We think that we will see a difference in arms sales and who we sell arms sales to, issues around Saudi Arabia, and more pushback. We saw that the Obama administration did do some things that we certainly didn't like with Saudi Arabia, which certainly led to some of the war on Yemen. But at the end of the Obama administration, you'll remember they were holding back arms sales and they were trying to put pressure on Saudi Arabia, specifically on Yemen. So we expect that pressure to be stronger now. And then transparency. There's been a lot of stuff, hidden reports not done, hard for congressional staff to get information. So we expect to see more transparency, which should help us in our work. And there's probably a whole host of other things like executive orders. So we saw under the Trump administration that they did a ton of executive orders that the Biden administration will be reversing and hopefully doing good executive orders on not only our issues, but issues that we all care about, such as the climate crisis. Now, taking a look at Congress, there's going to be certainly a lot of change up because of, on the Senate, we'll see changes of chairmanships. Will make a big difference. Obviously, if the Democrats get the Senate, then you're going to have all these new Democratic chairs of committees, and we expect it would be Leader Schumer who will be able to drive the Senate and have a lot of control there. Even if Republicans keep it, then there are a lot of chairs that will be switching up there because some senators have retired, lost their seats, or the Republicans have chairmanship. You can only have a chair for so long, so some term limits. So we'll see chairs change there, which could be for the better. On the House side, there will definitely also be chair fights. We're already involved in the chair fight on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, in which there are several candidates who are running, which includes Representative Meeks, Representative Sherman, and Representative Castro, in which we are leaning on supporting Castro as the most progressive person to chair on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Also, the Senate, the State Foreign and Policy SFOPS chair. We expect Barbara Lee to run for that, which we will probably support that. So there'll be some chairs moving around on the House side, which could really affect how some of our work moves forward on the House. Also, House Armed Services Committee, where the National Defense Authorization Act comes through, has lost a few members, so they're going to have new members, where there's going to be pressure to try to make those members more progressive. It is typically one of the more conservative committees, but we have good allies on there now, like Representative Khanna and others, and we hope to see more good allies go into that. We're already in conversations with Chairman Smith on what the National Defense Authorization Act may look like next year, and putting pressure on where we can see cuts and reduce that Pentagon footprint. I think because mostly moderates have lost in the House, that means the Congressional Progressive Caucus will have actually a higher percentage of people in the House. I haven't seen those exact numbers yet, and it's unclear which new members for sure will be joining the caucus, but that will hopefully mean they'll have more influence. In the lame duck, which is between now and the beginning of next year, we're not expecting a lot to happen. NDA will get solved. I don't think we're going to have a lot to play there. It seems like a lot of stuff is already being dealt with, but we will work on that. And then they will need to pass something to keep the government funding past December 11th. So we're expecting either a continuing resolution or some sort of a big omnibus bill in which we will certainly weigh in, continue to push to make sure there's not more Pentagon spending and there's more spending on things that we would like to see. So looking a little bit into the future, There's a lot of challenges. Let's first talk about elections. We know that there are a lot of state houses that went to Republicans, which means the Republicans will control a lot of the making of districts and the gerrymandering, which is going to have an impact on House seats in the long term. Looking at elections in 2022, there are more Republican senators up than Democrats. You'll remember Hassan eked out her election last time by only a few thousand votes. So will she be in a tight election? I don't know. You guys can tell me. It seems like Democrats did quite well, besides the governor, which well, we all know that the governor that you have is pretty popular. The other big thing that we'll see is there's this big strategic shift on China. And we see this Cold War mentality moving on China, even with Democrats, especially over the last few years. And that will be something that we will have to work on, the US-China relationship and the constant pressure that we need to be building up our military to fight China is one of the things that we'll have to work on. And then lastly, I will say it's going to be the internal fight within Democrats between, if you already heard and seen, with moderates pointing their fingers at progressives for some of their, especially in the House, where they end up losing like 10 seats or so, when some folks thought they were going to gain 10 seats. That fight is already happening between moderates and progressives on, how to move the Democratic Party forward. I would have to say, if you look, there was a lot of progressive things that did pass around the country, laws around cannabis, the $15 minimum wage law in Florida, and many others. So I think that this finger pointing from moderates is undue, but we will probably see that fight. So I will stop there, and Lilly and I are happy to take questions or comments.
Thank you both. Before we go too much further, I want to just lay some basics for how to get your questions in. Feel free to just shout out if you have any questions, or raise your hands and I'll recognize you, or you can enter your questions into the chat, and I'll read those off if you put them in the chat. But I wanted to start. I actually have 3 questions just in hearing you talk that I wanted to jump right on. The first around JCPOA. If we assume the Georgia seat, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that's the Iran agreement. I have the nasty habit of speaking in alphabet soup sometimes. So the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action around Iran, do we think that that's something that the president is going to be able to correct on his own just by waiving the sanctions and entering back into it, or is there going to need to be work done around that, and shoring up our senators and making sure that everything is it going to have to be redone is the essence of my question. Either one of you, you both have a lot of experience with national movements towards these things, so either one of you can weigh in.
Thanks, Lilly. Yeah, I mean, I think there will be challenges because there is, things have changed since the Trump administration basically has torn up the agreement and have increased huge amounts of sanctions. And they say they're going to increase sanctions more once a week now, but between now and when they leave office. So I don't think that we're just going to be some easy magic wand waving, but there's going to be work, and I think that you'll see some, sanctions relief, back to diplomacy, talking with the European allies. We'll remember it was the EU +2 who ended up helping put together the agreement in the first place, and those countries are very supportive of the agreement now. So they'll be eager to work with the Biden administration to see a path forward. So I do think you'll see I don't have an insight exactly, how the Biden administration is going to move forward. And even if I did, I probably wouldn't talk about it. So I think that they probably have an idea on stuff that they can do immediately. And then they will be, having conversations with our European allies and hoping that there's not shenanigans that the Congress will end up doing to make it more difficult. I mean, that is what happened last time. There was at least one big law that was passed, and that was made it more challenging. It was that law that was passed by Congress that the Trump administration was able to take advantage of, and it's part of the reasons that they were able to do some of the things that they did. So I never underestimate the power of the Israel lobby, even though the JCPOA went forward, and if you saw, J Street did some really good polling. I think there's like 70 some odd percent by the polling that they had in support of the JCPOA by their Jewish community that they polled. So I do think that it'll move forward, but there will probably be some speed bumps, and it's unclear to me how fast it will move forward.
Well, thanks. I guess we'll have to play that by ear. Sarah, I'll get you in a second. I'm going to actually combine my second question with Judy's question here. So Judy asks how much U.S.-Russia negotiation is required to get New START extended. And I know a week or two ago we were hearing that the Trump administration was willing to sign an extension, but that there was some backroom hang up around one contentious point in New START that was still being talked about, but that it looked like an extension was being done. But with the with it looking like Biden's going to be in office, we can expect a regular extension of START, or is that something that we think there's work? And then my question around nuclear policy is, do you think there's any chance of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty being something we could readopt? It's something that I think the Russians claimed we were in violation of. We claimed the Russians were in violation of. Trump pulled us out of it. Can we get back into that? Can we talk about intermediate range nuclear forces, or is that probably something that at this point, now that the cat's out of the bag, we're not getting it back in?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see exactly how the Biden administration moves forward. I mean, there is still some sort of a chance that something happens between the Russians and the Trump administration. It's tough to see. There was negotiations happening. Now the calculus may be very different by the Russians now they know that Biden has won. So it'll be unclear if there is movement there, but I do expect that Biden will do what they can. It's a very short window for them once they come in. So negotiations will be challenging. So they'll probably just do whatever is easiest, which could be like a short extension to then allow for more negotiations. And then it's unclear to me whether the Biden administration will move forward piecemeal. So let's deal with START. Then let's talk about some other issues, INF or open skies. There's a whole bunch of treaties that they're going to do it like one by one, or will they try to combine some things? I don't have the answer to that question. People probably know there was a good 2,000 advisors to the Biden administration specific to foreign policy. And so a lot of them have been working out various plans to think about how to move forward and what the sequencing will be. But clearly, any treaty is going to be challenging. A new treaty would be challenging to get. It's going to be a very narrow Senate, and to get anything ratified, it's going to be very, very difficult. We already saw, as good as START was, the bad thing we remember about New START, which we did support, peace action, and we did work on. The bad thing was some of the concessions the Obama Biden administration did, specifically to escalate spending around so-called modernization of nuclear weapons. Now, the Obama administration would claim that the deal that they had struck back then is not what it looks like now. They were not expecting all this money to be spent on this huge amount of money. It's increased. The first time people talked about it, it was a few $100 million, and it's like $1 trillion now. It's over $2 trillion. I mean, it just has ballooned. And this is not what the Obama administration got into, but unfortunately, it was one of the things. So it's hard to see new treaties just because of the Senate makeup, but it could be other agreements, executive orders.
All right. Thanks, Sarah. Did you want to jump in?
Well, actually, if I go back to Iran for a second here, I was curious about the take on the general humanitarian license idea that for COVID relief in Iran. Do you have any insights on that?
And Lilly, do chime in anytime you want. Sorry. I think one of the issues that we will see a difference in that I actually didn't mention is issues around sanctions. I think there is a slow movement in changing that debate. It's something that we have worked on the last few years, especially just to change the debate within the Democratic Party. And you've seen a lot of letters, more concern, bills, backroom conversations about, okay, look, sanctions don't work. There are studies that show that sanctions aren't working as far as changing the foreign policy or sometimes the behavior of other countries. And even worse, you're killing innocent people with sanctions. I mean, that's also very clear. So I do think that we will see some work done on sanctions and some better things happening around that. What that looks like exactly, I don't know. But just one, you'll get personnel into the right places. So you're going to see a change in personnel. Sanctions are very complicated. So, it comes from State Department, it comes from Treasury Department, and there's also, there's a lot of different moving government parts that deal with sanctions. So getting better personnel there to deal with it, I think will be good. And then we'll just see, I think, better treatment of NGOs. Some of our allies that we work with, that we try to help, actually have programs that work in countries. For example, AFSC has one of the largest working programs in North Korea. They had big challenges to try to get their program to work over the last 4 years. Huge challenges where to get the proper visas and the licensing was taking years, and they weren't able to do their program. So I definitely expect that we'll see a lot of changes that will help with sanctions, and we will continue to hopefully move that that debate. That sanctions is just not your first thing to do just because you don't want to put boots on the ground. Sanctions kills just as much as a tank or a missile or anything else.
Thank you. So this one I'm gonna direct at Lilly. So Lilly, from your perspective as campaigns organizer, what grassroots campaigns do you think are going to be the most critical for us to be working on to build support around different things? And what types of grassroots campaigns do you think are going to be the most important given the new makeup?
Well, I mean, all eyes are on Georgia right now, right? So in the immediate term, that's going to be top priority. And it really, the fact that it's leaning toward Biden now does show that Georgia is the new purple state. So in terms of activities, one great thing has been about us being so robustly involved in these campaigns was just being able to provide our organizing expertise to a lot of these campaigns. So obviously when COVID hit, a virtual sort of approach had to be adopted by all of these campaigns. And so how do you virtually grassroots? Well, we've had this affiliate network scattered through the country for decades and have worked out ways to communicate and organize accordingly. And so we were able to provide some of that expertise to these campaigns. And I think our phone banking efforts really demonstrated the path forward. We were able to get folks from safe states phone banking for these key swing districts and states. And so I think that that's something that can be adopted. Paul mentioned in 2022, y'all have a senator who's going to have to potentially have support. And so we'll see what happens then. But, that map is going to be a bit more favorable for us. But even the current favorable 2020 Senate map, we still had a ways to go and couldn't flip Texas, couldn't flip Iowa and some of these other places. So I think phone banking and really taking that virtual kind of grassroots organizing and ramping it up in the approaching, whatever special elections and recounts and other things are going to happen in the next year. And then in 2022 is going to be critical to that. Paul, did you have any particular races to add or strategies? Okay.
All right. Well, we got through a lot of my questions faster than I was hoping, and I want to take it in a direction that I asked Paul about before most people were on, and that is in talking about the new Secretary of Defense. And Paul, you said, well, it's not likely to be relevant, and I worry that with only a couple months to go, the switch out is intentional. And I just want to play a little clip of our new acting Secretary of Defense in his own words that might that I just want to think about, and I want to know if it alarms anyone else or if anyone else hears these words the way I do. Let me see if I can pull this off. All right, hang on just a moment.
Called an unconventional warfare. That was my specialty versus direct action, which is what we typically think about in counterterrorism, where you're kicking down doors, you're taking people out of buildings or killing them. I've done both, but my passion was in unconventional warfare, which is what we call a subset now of irregular warfare, where it's kind of hard. It sounds cliche, hearts and minds, but really what we're talking about is competing for the population's loyalty. And when I came back into the business after retiring, I'd had a few years off.
So that was actually the only thing I wanted to put. Oh, sorry about that. Hang on. We are being Zoom bombed, I believe. Nope, it's just me. Sorry about that. Did you hear that?
Nope, just hear you.
Oh, I just booted someone out of our meeting because somebody came in with a number and I didn't know who they were. And there was an autoplay of a video and I thought we were being Zoom bombed. Well, sorry for that person. So what alarms me about that is the idea that at this juncture, President Trump decided that he needed to fire his Secretary of Defense. And put someone else in. And that makes me think that his Secretary of Defense was unwilling to execute an order or was being in some way opposed to what he's currently thinking. And that he brought in somebody whose specialty is psychological warfare. He also, his work history is in primarily technology. So he has career in special forces and then moved to a tech firm that does intelligence work. And so I worry that this is an attempt to sway, that he is going to try to use the Pentagon to sway public opinion in his favor. Do you think that at this point it seems like everybody's collectively let out a sigh of relief that the election is over? But this firing got me nervous, and I'm wondering what if anything it means. And so if either one of you have thoughts on that, I'd love to hear them.
Okay, not seeing Lilly unmute. So I think that there's been rumors that Esper was going to leave in the last few weeks. He had his resignation letter, I think, together. People say as early as the Freedom Plaza episode, and there was also differences between Esper and Trump on renaming bases. Esper was fine with renaming bases, which is currently in the House part of the National Defense Authorization Act, but not the Senate. It's one of the big fights where some people don't want to rename bases from Confederate generals, Confederate names. So I think it's just like a very Trump thing. Was not happy with Esper crossing him in several things. There could be more things that we don't know about. Esper was ready to resign. People thought he was actually going to resign a couple weeks ago, and instead, held out and made Trump fire him. Who knows? I'm just not as concerned because I just feel like there's just not a lot of time between now and the transition. It is a problem with I think in the transition itself, because there's a lot, if you really want to do a very good and thorough transition, it's better to have someone who was already at the helm. And is this person a Trump, a very Trump yes person who's going to make it more difficult on the transition to the Biden administration? I don't know. I do think that, Trump does seem to be a person who doesn't necessarily want to go to war, though it does seem like we came very, very close a number of times with North Korea and Iran. So it's hard for me to see that happening over the next couple of months, especially there's, some people are speculating maybe Trump would try to run again in 4 years. So would you want to do something super crazy before you did that? Or that some of his children might want to run. I mean, no gasp. I'm sorry. I'm sure people are already getting their anxiety raised when I say those things, but that's what people certainly talk about. So, I'm not super concerned, and it was people had saw it coming. And Trump can still do a fair amount of damage between now and the November 20th. But I think that I'm just not. It's just not something that I'm overly concerned about. It's Pentagon, as you know, is like 3 million. It's like 3 million people, and a lot of some of those people are good people. I talk to people on the down low who work at the Pentagon, and some people really do want to try to do the right thing if we don't have the exact same vision on what that is. So I think it would be difficult and especially someone new who's just coming in, who's got to find their sea legs. I just think I'm not so concerned, but I've been surprised by this administration several times, and I hope I don't get a bad surprise over the next couple of months.
Yeah, I would say the same, that I'm not necessarily as scared because of the limited amount of time that he's got to truly make an impact. And especially because, this is a man who's going to want a career afterwards and knows that he's on his way in and out. And so it's like, he can carry that title, but that means that doing something shocking might jeopardize his future career. And so hopefully, if nothing else, that keeps him in check.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking psyop, like trying to get people to stand up. But I've spent folks on this call are aware I have poo-pooed a lot of people who have used the word coup in the lead up to this election, and the timing was alarming to me. But I hadn't read anything about displeasure with Esper, so that it makes a lot more sense in that light. So thank you, Paul, for that, and thank you, Lilly. Amy wanted to ask, what calls should we be making to our reps right now? Where can we make the most difference? Are there coordinated efforts yet on specific issues? So I know we're right after the election, but what are we thinking is going to come up in the lame duck that we need to be working on?
Well, immediately there is a letter that I have not had time to send around. That's around the general licensing issue, and maybe you've seen it from other organizations. And I don't think either of your reps are on it. So there's a general licensing letter about sanctions that currently has about 50 House members on it and a dozen senators. It's bicameral. The due date currently is Wednesday, end of business. So, one thing would be reaching out to have that letter signed, and that's being led by Representative Chuy Garcia of Illinois. So that would be one thing that's like immediate. If you're going to try to get a couple calls in or send an email to staff that you can just ask them to sign that letter. I'm sure they've gotten it a few times, even if I don't send it around. Unfortunately, I just like slammed with briefings, this, that, and the other, to do a ton of work on it as it stands. But that's an immediate thing that I think that will be helpful on the sanctions issue long term. And then I'm guessing some of the second thing that we'll be working on will be some of these chair positions. What's not clear to me is whether or not we're going to be using grassroots around these chair positions. Not typically something that necessarily works. Maybe asking Will if he has connections with any of the chiefs of staff of your members. I mean, those are the staff that helps make the decisions about voting for chairs. They're done with secret ballots, so we don't even know who votes, and so usually it's the chief of staff and the member that makes the decision. So it's not like letters written are the things that typically make an impact there. It's more the relationship you may have. So we're still working to figure out what's the best strategy for our affiliates around the chair stuff. And we're working with not only House staff of the chairs that we think that will be good, but also with our colleagues and coalitions to kind of figure out the best strategy. So that would probably be the next thing. And then there may be other sign-on or getting members to speak out specifically to Biden appointees. We definitely want to see, more progressive appointees, more diverse appointees, and there may be some efforts around that in which Grassroots can support. I think there may be some petitions that we might end up sending around over the next few weeks to put pressure on the Biden administration on appointees. So those will be some efforts there. And then we're just kind of tracking the National Defense Authorization Act. There are a number of things in there that we would like to see or not like to see, and just to try to figure out what's the best way to move on there. You probably know there's $10 million in the Senate version for possible nuclear testing. We'd like to get that removed. There's some good language talking about sanctions, specifically on a report coming from the Pentagon on the effectiveness on sanctions. We'd like to see that report to stay in. And there's like big monies, like there's one extra submarine that's $1.7 billion. Those affecting the NDAA conference is a very challenging thing. So we're trying to see where it is that we can lean in, and we'd be reaching out to you guys to see if there are letters that members are signing around the NDAA when the conferees are announced, etc. So those, I think, are some of the short-term things that I see within the next several weeks.
Yeah. And for folks on the call, just from a local perspective, last cycle, Congressman Pappas was a conferee on the NDAA, and whether or not she's a conferee, Senator Shaheen always has a huge impact on this process. She has a very tight relationship with a few of the Republicans on the committee who usually are conferees, including Senator Risch. So we may have moments where we want to be making some noise around around the NDAA, and we'll have Paul and Lilly to look to for that when we get there. Go back. I had a few more questions that I wanted to ask. And this one again is more toward Lilly. What do you see grassroots work around trying to shrink Pentagon budget? Because especially here in New Hampshire, there's a need for us to message that very carefully. We're highly dependent on Pentagon contracting jobs and the naval shipyard. So when we talk about decreasing Pentagon spending, get a lot of pushback, including from progressives and Democrats who want to protect those jobs. So what are you seeing in grassroots campaign messaging that's working well, or tactics that are shifting the debate around Pentagon spending and shifting to human needs?
Yeah, thanks, Will. I think that I'll also allow Paul to speak to it, but I can start because he's on one of our coalitions around the Pentagon budget. But I think one thing in terms of messaging that particularly this year is a good opportunity is around COVID. Showing the fact that our frontline workers didn't have PPE, and we're still struggling and making homemade masks and caps and all of these kinds of things when they're the ones who are taking care of this current national security threat. And so it's about recognizing that the future threats to our collective safety aren't going to come in the form of wars and bombs and things that can be solved with those kinds of approaches, but in the form of more pandemics, the coming climate catastrophe. Those are the things that are truly going to put our security at risk in this country. And so it's about re-evaluating, our whole approach in that sense. And the Pentagon budget, as Paul has pointed out, is just massively, funded compared to things like the State Department, the Education Department, and, obviously Medicare for all is a discussion that's going on right now because we still can't get healthcare for all of our people during this pandemic. And so I think like those kinds of grassroots messages have really resonated. And one wonderful thing about the Barbara Lee legislation to cut Pentagon spending that came out earlier this year was that she really did have her staff do the research and look at bottom line places where the cuts could be made. And so being able to counter to some of the folks who tend to come back with, well, what about the troops sort of messages, and being able to say look, this isn't cutting troop salaries. This is cutting the waste and the bloat that comes with it. And I think that that's a really important thing to push back on. It is difficult in places like New Hampshire, like you said, because of the naval shipyard. And so we found that sort of being a struggle with some of the other kinds of candidates that we've endorsed who have military installations in their districts and in their states. But I think just making it clear that, look, cutting the top line does not necessarily eat into these district and state things. And obviously, again, what does security really look like? But I don't know if Paul has more on what the group is messaging right now, particularly to the new administration.
Well, we certainly always talk about, that the Pentagon spending is not a jobs program. I mean, we all sort of know that it's actually the worst way to spend government money if you want to see jobs. In fact, if you gave a $1,000 tax cut, you would get more jobs than $1,000 spent in the Pentagon. You get 8 times more jobs investing in climate stuff, and 5 times more jobs or 3 times more jobs investing in education. So it's not a jobs program, but it's hard to tell someone that who has that job. I get it. So there does need to be a transition, which we certainly had after the Cold War. There was transition programs. There's actually funding in the past. There's offices in which there's a funding on how you transition out of that. And that, there should be efforts around making sure that you transition workers from doing whatever they're building, from building ships to building windmills or whatever you want to do. I mean, there are ways to transition that, and that's stuff that needs to be worked on. And if you care about climate crisis, which if you looked at some of the exit polling, was huge amount of people who are concerned about the climate crisis. The Pentagon is the worst polluter. It's like the 42nd, if it was a country, it would be like the 42nd worst country in the world as far as polluting. 300,000 barrels of oil every day from the Pentagon, something like that. So if you care about climate crisis, we cannot continue to give the Pentagon more money and build, these huge weapons that are, using oil and et cetera. So it's a difficult issue, but the coalition is broadening. I mean, the coalition that people had worked on over the last couple of years, people over the Pentagon, where really had groups like Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth and other groups that work on immigration. I mean, people realize like it is sucking money from other important things, and we need to work on bringing it down. I know it doesn't help necessarily with folks on the ground who have jobs, but there's got to be more people in New Hampshire who care about those other issues than the people who have the jobs. And it's not like we're certainly not supporting, people losing jobs. We're looking at, finding ways where actually there's going to be more jobs. If we're spending this money elsewhere, we're going to be creating more jobs.
Thank you. And Chris, it's got to be a quick question because we're almost at the end of our time.
Yes. Is there any timeliness to bringing up or emphasizing the need for a Pentagon audit, a really meaningful one?
Go ahead. I'm struggling with my technology.
Okay. Yeah, it's always a good thing. I would have to say the Trump administration had moved forward with, hiring good auditors and spending more money on that. So that was one of the good things the Trump administration did. So we need to continue to work on that. And it is, as you know, the only government agency that does not pass an audit. And so there needs to be consequences for that.
Lily, do you have anything to add on that, or shall we close out?
I think Paul summed it up pretty well. Definitely their two failed audits have been something that Republicans and Democrats get frustrated about. And so this is an issue where there is bipartisan push to, cut back on the waste. And so I think ties into the, Pentagon budget overall, just to waste kind of arguments that do appeal to both sides. So good messaging there.
Great. Thank you both so much for being with us tonight, for taking the time right after the election. I know you're both must be exhausted after all the work you've been doing. Really appreciate you coming out so that we could get a little direction as we look forward. Want to invite folks on the call, please, to join us every other Monday night from 7 to 8. Our next several programs will be the Reverend Kendra Ford, who will talk about the work that reconnects. So how to heal the divides between us is some of that. Jenny Walkup, who's one of our former youth, went through our youth program, is going to be doing perspective on anti-Semitism from the only Jewish kid in town. And then around December 21st, we'll be talking about homelessness in New Hampshire. So I hope to see you all then, and have a great night. Thanks again. I
just want to quickly wrap up with a shout out to Paul as well, and a huge thanks to all the work that he's put into this, because, once the elections wrapped, he was immediately on conference calls once more with the people over Pentagon and other coalitions that he's part of to navigate these next steps. And so huge shout out for him not quite ever being able to take a break.
Great. All right. Good night, folks.